Started
Yeah.
recording. Okay. So hello everyone, welcome back to this channel and thank you for tuning into this episode with me, Sneha. And today we have with us Abby Bangser from London. Abby is working as an SRE currently in London and she's a software delivery professional. She's also the go-to person for any of us with DevOps related questions. So Abby is awesome and forever helpful. So today we're going to talk to Abby about a lot of things to understand how DevOps works and to understand the world of DevOps from a deeper sense from Abby's perspective. So welcome, Abby. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for asking me. I love this topic and I'm excited to chat with you on it. So thanks for having me.
Awesome. So Abby, I was thinking we can start with something like, what is your perspective of DevOps and how do you define DevOps?
Yeah, it's fantastic. I think DevOps has a lot of meanings in the industry today. I definitely tend to subscribe to the idea of it being about the development and operations of software working closely together. So it's not about a role in itself, nor is it about combining the developer role and the operator role. It's about making sure that when you're building software, you're thinking about what it will take to operate it long term. And when you're operating software, you're thinking about how the people developing and making changes to that software can do so safely and quickly, because that's really how the business thrives, is through those kinds of changes. So
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. So you've held traditional positions of business analyst, quality analyst, you've been in development and then went to platform engineering. Can you talk to us a little bit about your experience and how that experience has helped you become a better DevOps engineer or be in that field and contribute to that field of software delivery better?
yeah, absolutely. I think anytime that you get to see multiple angles personally, you grow. There's a lot of talk about the pendulum between being an individual contributor and being a manager, and how once you've seen the experience as a manager, you become a more informed and more empathetic individual contributor. And when you've been an individual contributor recently as a manager, you can be empathetic and aware of those challenges. So I think the same thing goes when it comes to software delivery. When you've been a part of the side that's catching the delivered code and trying to operate it, you can understand how that feels and you can understand the challenges associated. But when you've been a part of the delivery team that feels like they have no visibility into production, they have no kind of control in that space, you can also understand how that feels. So yeah, I think that's really been a journey of empathy and a journey of understanding the challenges associated with the different eras of a life cycle, right? The building versus the operating side of things.
Okay. Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Abby. It makes sense. And what do you think, like, according to you, what are some skills that a good DevOps engineer should have?
Yeah. I think that one of the skills is never settling. As much as that might sound very fluffy and hand wavy, I think that the skill within DevOps is never settling for uncomfortable or difficult situations. You're always looking for where you can automate things that are human driven, where that don't need to be. So we call that toil. So when you're doing something as a human that doesn't actually require the insights and the decision making that humans bring to the table, well, let's offload that to the computers. And let's make sure that we therefore enable the humans to spend their time on the things that they bring value to. So I think never settling, always rooting out any of that toil, any of those issues, is something that's quite key. I think another thing is having no fear of learning new things. It feels like I learn a new language or a new tool nearly daily or at least weekly. There's just so much out there. And I think understanding that if you have identified a pain point in your process, most likely someone else has. Most likely someone else has also tried to solve that. Now, the solutions that are out there may not be right for you or your organization or your team, but to have that intuition or that encouragement to go looking for a solution that might be out there in open source and maybe contribute to it, maybe make it more applicable to your organization, is you have to have a little bit of fearlessness to be able to go out there and learn new things and find those things. I think that's really important as well. There's obviously harder skills, like I think understanding the pros and cons of different scripting languages. So understanding Bash versus Python versus Ruby, understanding YAML versus JSON formats, and feeling comfortable to use those where they seem fit. Like I think, or at least read them. So like for example, Golang. I can't write Golang, but I can read enough of it to be able to understand the tools I'm using. And I think that's valuable as well. So yeah, I think there's a lot of things in there.
Thank you for that. And I think there's also a lot of collaboration and trying to be, as you mentioned, staying at the top of, what's out there to try and learn new things that's just available. Thank you for that.
Collaboration was an oversight for sure. I'm glad you brought that up because the whole point is trying to bring together professionals with so many varying backgrounds. So your ability to communicate with everybody and make sure that everybody's voices is heard is paramount. So yeah, thank you. That was an oversight.
So I just want to understand, for the viewers watching, what does the day-to-day life of a DevOps engineer look like?
Oh, this is going to look very different in different organizations. I guess I'll say what maybe my experiences have been, acknowledging that I have close friends that have had very different experiences. So for me, whenever I'm carrying the title of DevOps engineer, my goal is to work myself out of a job. And that's my entire team's goal, because we believe that DevOps is about the way you deliver software and not about the job that you do. So that being said, I have had the title of DevOps engineer before because there's often some groundwork tooling that the teams that are delivering software features maybe aren't being empowered to implement or introduce, but they still need them to be able to work in a DevOps focused way. And so they'll spin up a team temporarily to support creating those tools, and then hopefully disband that in time. So what does that look like then? So I would say it looks like spending some time understanding what the teams are working on. So I tend to spend time either pairing with software engineers or at least driving by their desks and understanding their problem statements, maybe having retrospectives with them, different techniques to try and gather like where are their pain points in delivering software. I also engage heavily on the operations side. So again, either engaging in ongoing incidents or debriefs, retrospectives about previous incidents to understand what life looks like from the operator side of the fence. And then a large part of it is about productizing the work that we're doing. So the work that you may see is work with like a CI/CD pipeline. So writing a pipeline as code. So you can do this in pretty much any tool today. So Jenkins and GitLab and GitHub and Circle CI and all of those. So I would be looking at writing the code to run, build and test and deploy stages for our software. But often I help figure out what the big picture is. Like, why are we writing this code? How are we going to keep this maintainable by our teams? So I spend some time doing that as well. So CI/CD pipelines is a big one. And environments is probably the other major one that you're working on. So this would involve sometimes moving from static hardware oriented environments where, for example, you have QA 1, 2, and 3, and you have to sign up on the the form for what time of day you get access to your test environment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Instead, we want to move to more dynamic environments that are based in the cloud that can be spun up on demand. And so building those environments, figuring out what they need, how realistic do they need to be, how do we train people in using them, all of that as well would be another big piece.
Thank you for that, Abby. I mean, that was like a clear picture. That's kind of the role that I'm doing right now as well. It's awesome that you actually mentioned everything.
So what did I miss? So CI/CD pipelines and environments are my two biggest points. Are you working on any other pieces?
For me too. So it's trying to get the test environment set up and environment set up for automation using Fargate and things like that.
Yeah.
And then CI/CD, trying to make the continuous integration, all that a possibility by adding tests, automated tests in the pipeline, things like that.
Yeah.
And I think it's so interesting, that I just experienced QA and testing and test automation, and gradually moved into this role where I'm doing infrastructure automation. So these are interesting things.
Definitely.
So another question I had was, when you're working in this kind of environment, what kind of agile process have you followed before? Because I think different companies have a different process they follow, and it may get confusing because when you try to do Scrum, but then you never know when you're going to get requests from other teams. So I'm curious to see what you followed in your experience before.
That is such a good question. So I'll answer a little bit idealistically, and then I'll also answer realistically. So DevOps teams that are working on environments and CI/CD, I think tend to operate closer to the operations side. What I mean by that is they tend to see the work they're doing as interrupt driven. So they get a lot of requests for support. And they also tend to see the work they're doing as fairly large feedback loops, like that they have a lot of a big piece of work they have to deliver before they would see any value. I would say I disagree with those statements. In general, I think that there is a lot of interrupt driven work, but often given the right communication and given the right conversations, that interrupt work isn't actually necessary right this minute. And so putting into place a really strong filter for what needs to be done right now and what needs to be done soon is really key. And so one thing we've done to try and support that is we have a kind of a single point of entry for pieces of work. We have a person who's allocated to tracking that work and deciding where priority sits to understand the landscape as a whole. That could be a product owner. Ideally, that's a product owner. It could be a team lead. It could be an engineer going on rotation, doing that for a week or doing that for a month or whatever, right? So someone though needs to understand the product landscape, ideally at a larger scale than weekly, ideally more looking at like quarterly or even annually, so that they can make those decisions about what needs to be done right away and communicate back to the people requesting that we hear you, we know it's important. We're also not going to do that today. We're going to do that in a month because we already have that scheduled in, right? And then making sure that our engineers are allocated to that if we have enough engineers on our team, that we have maybe one person allocated to interrupt work and everybody else is still working on feature work. So that's one way we've handled the interrupt driven aspects. As for the product side, I think that we get into this trap of we think that like to deliver value, we have to deliver an entire environment. And sometimes that's the case. Sometimes there will be no value to any of our users until we've done over a month of effort. But I find that if we chip away at that assumption, we actually can often find smaller loops of value, and that we really need to fight for those, because a month of effort for a DevOps engineer or an engineer who has the skills associated with automating and putting together environments is expensive. And it's also a huge opportunity cost because the output for this team is supposed to be a multiplier. It's supposed to be something that can support tens to hundreds to possibly thousands of developers, depending on what organization scale you're at. And so if you spend a month building something and it turns out that only some of your developers can get value from it, you've really missed an opportunity there. So yeah, so I think that when it comes to agile processes, using things like personas and going out and getting real user testing with people is key. Doing retrospectives and sometimes inviting our customers in to retrospect on the outputs that we've given is really important, getting feedback there. And putting in smaller delivery windows. So whether that be 1 week or 2 week iterations, actually trying to deliver a value within an iteration space, I think feels really difficult at first and actually turns out to be a huge game changer when teams can learn how to do it for this kind of work.
Great. I agree with that 100%. So, observability is something that's so hot right now. Everyone's talking about observability. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, Abby? I think I understand it, but I also think I don't understand it. I'm like, everyone has their own definition of observability. I'd like to hear from your point of view. What do you think about observability?
I think everybody feels like they get it and then they don't get it and then they get it again. Observability can feel really slippery, I think, because it's not an on-off switch and it's not something you can buy. So therefore, you're always feeling like you can move the needle a bit more. So as soon as you start to get a little bit of observability, you realize how much more opportunity there is. And so then you say, well, was I actually doing observability or not? And yeah, so the definition that I think is widely used today is around control theory. And so the idea of how much can you understand about your system from the outside. And I think that can trip people up sometimes, in part because it's a bit difficult to fully apply to software, but in part because it actually makes you feel like you're doing good work, like good observability based solely on the data you're putting out, right? So if you're using metrics and logs and traces, you're like, I can understand so many things from the outside. Look at all this data that I have on my system. And where observability is really, to me, really becomes valuable and interesting is when you can ask questions of your system and you can explore your system. And I think that the real crux, the real subtle change for people is when they stop thinking of observability as purely telemetry, purely what data does my system put out there? And they start to look at it as how easily can I ask questions of that data? Because my experience, I thought I had observability when I started doing monitoring and logging and tracing. I was so excited I could ask questions I never could have asked previously. But as I started experiencing this, I found myself dancing between these different tools. I had to learn query languages in 3 different tools. I had to use PromQL to understand Prometheus metrics. I had to use the specialty Kibana language as well to understand that. I had to have pure SQL to understand my data that's in the database. And anytime I found an insight in one place, I had to recraft the query that found me that insight in a different data source to understand how the data work together. And so I think where observability really has a nuanced value is when you can have a single location with a single query language and you can see trends in metrics, you can see details in service calls, like what you can do with tracing, and you can see details in the components of your request, in the data, the parameters that you used, which is typically found in logs. When you have all of that in a single query language, in a single user interface, all of a sudden now that concept of explorability just jumps out at you because you can be asking these high-level questions and these low-level questions in such fluid movement. And I think that's where observability really takes shape. So,
Abby, that was so clear. You really have a great way of explaining things that, I think it comes so effortlessly to you. When you explain something,
Years.
it's just so clear.
Good. Well, I'm
Thank you
glad. I
for
think
that.
I've been working on that explanation for a long time. It's only starting to come together. So,
Thank you for that. So Abby, so what's new that you are up to, and what are some things that you are learning that's new for you right now?
really good question. So, I would say in the last maybe 6 months or so, the biggest introduction for me has been getting involved in GitOps.
Hmm.
And so GitOps is, I think, just a continuation of a lot of the other ideas that we've been working towards as a part of the DevOps kind of community and delivery processes. GitOps is the concept that anything that you want to deploy to your environment should be in configuration, should be in code in Git. And so we've already moved there with, like, as we had talked about before, the CI/CD pipelines as code. We've talked about infrastructure as code. Well, now we're talking about all of our configuration of things as code. And so in our case, it's been particularly around Kubernetes, and so particularly using a tool called Argo CD, where we're
Hmm.
talking about changing the process from us deploying services out to Kubernetes in kind of a push format. Hey, we're going to go apply these changes, to GitOps being more of a watching process and pulling in and confirming that whatever's in Git is running in my cluster. And so, yeah, it's been an interesting journey around how does that change how we construct our repositories? How does that change our pipelines? How does that change our understanding of what good looks like in our environment? Like, it does a lot of, like, this auto healing and auto deployment and eventual consistency. Well, how do we know when things are good then, right?
Hmm.
Yeah, and so it's been really an interesting journey and really fun.
That sounds really fun. So I'm just curious, you mentioned, how do we see what good looks like? Do you go with this is what good looks like for me and then start working on it, or does it happen organically while you're working with it to kind of come up with what do we is this what we wanted or something like that?
Yeah, I think it grows, if I'm honest. So, like, an example being that I mentioned eventual consistency with this, that, like, it can take, in the old world, you would tell it to deploy, and then it would either say it did or didn't do that successfully. And you would know it, like, pretty quickly, and you could fail a pipeline if that push deployment failed. Well, in the new world, it could take, depending on your settings, up to 3, 5 something amounts of minutes before an environment starts to change into what you've set in Git. How do you decide if you're going to fail a pipeline? Like, do you wait 3 to 5 minutes? Do you hard code a time that says if it isn't working by this time, then the pipeline has failed? Or do you accept that, this is going to be eventual and you need to actually get your indicators of success on deployment separately from your pipeline, which is a very different experience for a lot of our developers? So um, I think we have to return back to basics. So when you ask about, like, how do you define quality, or what does good look like, we have
Hmm.
to kind of return back to our basics of what do we care about. And if what we care about is that our developers who make a change can have confidence that their change has successfully rolled out and is behaving in a good way, that's what we care about. How do we do that in this new world? Is it through pipelines, or is it not? Is it through some other version of alerts, some maybe Slack messages, maybe, something else that happens? And so, yeah, I think it evolves as we go.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I think that's the best way, right? Just keep evolving. Okay.
Absolutely. You have to. Yeah.
Yeah. So I have a last question for you, Abby.
All right.
So a lot of testers when they think of moving to a different position, DevOps is something that comes to mind. So what are some tips, like how do they transition or slowly start to gain some experience in the tools that will be helpful for them to get into like a DevOps position? So just your tips on that for testers who would like to transition to DevOps.
As you say, I think it's a super natural transition. So I think that, first of all, that's great. And we need more people thinking like this. I think the smoothest transition I see for people is when they start to get involved with how their tests run. So this is particularly for people who already write automation. So I think there's probably layers here, right? But so this is someone who already writes code. How to get into DevOps for me is about debugging how their tests run. That means they're probably going to get exposure to how metrics work and how logging works, because they're going to have to learn, how do they identify their slowest tests? How do they track that over time? How do they decide which tests to speed up? That kind of thing. So that's metric work that you can transition then into DevOps work. You also then can have opportunities of focusing on like parallelizing your tests. Now you got to probably get involved in the code in your CI/CD pipelines. You're going to get exposure to that and start having questions there. And debugging what's in your environments. Like these are the kinds of areas where instead of handing them off to someone, figuring out how to pair with someone on it or how to debug it yourself is going to be, I think, your best tool. So so CI/CD pipeline infrastructure as code is going to be a good insight. As a non-coder, I think you also have an opportunity to move into this kind of space. I think that you have a huge potential to be like a product owner in the space of DevOps. We talked earlier, DevOps changes people assume have to be these really big changes that are like, months of effort, right? I think as QAs, we have a skill set around seeing small changes, of requesting small changes so that we can test things in a safer way, more deterministic way. And I think that if you can start to understand the landscape of DevOps, reading things like the DevOps handbook, reading that have explanations of the way of delivering software that isn't tool specific, but is about what these teams are trying to achieve, is going to give you some insights, and then potentially you can help shape work for a team and work as a product owner for them. So I think that would be another in.
I think these are great points, because it kind of makes the transition very natural and organic. And I think moving from a tester's role to a DevOps role also may come in very naturally to people, because like even while they're doing test automation, sometimes you have to build the infrastructure for running your automation. Sometimes you want to move from using a traditional machine to the cloud, and then you figure out how you run the grid in the cloud, and how can you set it up and tear it down and make it more efficient and things like that. I think those are also some ways to naturally try to learn what the DevOps work kind of looks like. So there's so much potential and so many opportunities and so many resources out there for people to take a look at.
Just being a bit selfish even at times, like if you feel like you can't test certain things because you don't have the right environment, learn about Docker. Learn about if you can make yourself an environment that allows you to test things in a better way, right? Like, so there's lots of ways to get involved. If you start, we talked about what skills you need. You need to start with this assumption that things can be better, and then just kind of tirelessly look for that way to speed things up and remove that toil from your life. And that's really going to be a great in for someone who writes code.
Absolutely. These are great tips. Thank you so much, Abby. I'm sure our viewers have really gained a lot out of this experience of talking to you and getting these tips from you. Thank you so much for being here. This was awesome.
Thank you. This has been great. Hopefully I can come back sometime.
Of course. Of course. Thank you, Abby. Let me stop recording.